Welcome to my channel, C.S. Lewis Spirit. Today's story begins with a question that has haunted people for centuries. What really happens when black magic collides with the power of the Bible? Imagine two worlds, one built on shadows, fear, and whispered curses, and the other rooted in faith, light, and unshakable truth. When those worlds crash into each other, the outcome is never simple, and the journey often leads through battles far deeper than what the eye can see. This is not just another tale about superstition or belief. This is about people, their choices, their fears, and the unseen war between darkness and light. It begins in a small town that, on the surface, looks like anywhere else. Children played in the streets, neighbors greeted each other with polite smiles, and Sunday mornings were filled with the sound of church bells echoing through the valley. But beneath that ordinary life, whispers floated around. Stories of strange events, of sickness that came without warning, of sudden misfortune, of shadows moving where no shadows should be. At the center of these whispers stood a man named Elias. Elias was no stranger to the darker side of life. He was a seeker, always hungry for knowledge, and somewhere along the way, he had stepped into practices that most people would never dare to touch. Some called it black magic. Others called it spiritual power. Whatever the name, Elias believed it gave him control over people, over outcomes, over life itself. Yet power gained in the shadows never comes without a price, and slowly Elias began to feel the weight of something pressing back against him. Not far away lived a woman named Miriam. She was known in the community as a quiet soul, deeply rooted in her faith, carrying her Bible everywhere she went. Miriam had seen hardship too, but instead of turning to shadows, she leaned into prayer. People often dismissed her as old-fashioned, too devout for the modern world. But those who knew her closely sensed a strength in her that didn't come from herself alone. Their paths crossed in a way that no one could have predicted. Elias, confident in his rituals, found himself face to face with forces he couldn't explain. The deeper he went, the more he realized he was being pulled into something far beyond his control. Strange visions tormented his nights. The very power he thought was his weapon began to feel like a trap closing around him. Desperate, he sought out answers, and every road seemed to point toward the one thing he had always dismissed, the Bible. But could words written centuries ago hold more power than the darkness he had embraced? Could faith really stand against forces that terrified him in the silence of the night? Miriam's quiet strength and her refusal to bend to fear became a light Elias couldn't ignore. Yet, the more he reached for that light, the stronger the shadows around him grew. And then, something happened. Something neither of them could have expected. The nights grew heavier for Elias. What once felt like strength now wrapped itself around him like chains. Every ritual, every symbol, every whispered word of black magic that he thought gave him control began to twist against him. Objects in his home shifted when no one touched them. Dreams bled into waking hours. He could no longer tell if the footsteps he heard at night were in his mind or in the room with him. Fear crept in, the kind of fear that doesn't vanish with the light of day. And yet, he was too deep to walk away. For Miriam, the strange presence surrounding Elias was not a surprise. She had seen before how darkness preyed on people searching for shortcuts to power or protection. But what unsettled her was the sudden heaviness she felt whenever she passed his house. It was as though something unseen lingered there, watching, daring her to step closer. She prayed quietly, yet she knew prayer alone would soon demand more from her. If Elias was reaching a breaking point, he might also be reaching for something dangerous that could spill over into the entire town. Whispers grew louder among the neighbors. Some avoided Elias altogether, crossing the street to keep their distance. Others secretly sought him out, hoping he could give them luck, love, or money. That only deepened his hold on the community, binding them in fear and fascination. But Miriam sensed that the true conflict was not Elias versus the townspeople. It was a battle inside Elias himself. The struggle between the shadows he invited and the light he desperately tried to ignore was tearing him apart. And then came the night when Elias, desperate and trembling, opened a Bible he had left untouched for years. The moment his eyes fell on the words, the air in the room shifted. But he wasn't alone. Elias froze as the pages trembled in his hands. The room felt colder, the shadows stretching across the walls as if they were alive. The words on the page seemed to burn into his eyes, words he could not ignore, though his heart pounded with resistance. Every flicker of the candlelight seemed to shape into faces, watching, mocking, waiting. His breaths grew shallow, and for the first time, he whispered into the silence, asking if God could even hear someone like him. The moment the words left his lips, the floor beneath him groaned, and the air grew heavy, as though something was trying to silence him before he could speak again. At that same hour, Miriam woke from a restless sleep. She had dreamed of Elias, standing in a storm with his hands stretched toward two different paths, one wrapped in fire and shadows, the other in radiant light. She could feel that his choice was coming soon, but she also knew that such choices never came without a fight. She picked up her Bible and began to pray, her voice steady even as a strange unease filled her chest. Back in Elias's home, the conflict raged louder. The more he read, the more the shadows pressed in, filling the corners of the room. Objects rattled on the shelves. The candle sputtered, almost snuffing out. Every instinct told him to shut the book, to run back to what he knew, but something deeper, something almost buried, urged him to hold on. His lips began to form the words written before him, though each syllable felt like it tore through the darkness itself. And just as the final word left his mouth, a force surged through the house. The ground seemed to shake, and then everything went still. The silence that followed was so heavy Elias could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the room. For a brief moment, he thought the storm had passed. The shadows that had been twisting across the walls seemed to melt away, leaving nothing but the faint glow of the candle. Relief swept over him, but before he could even exhale, the air cracked like a whip. A mirror across the room split in two, the sound sharp and jarring, and from its shattered surface, a low whisper began to spill into the air. It was his own voice, repeating every word of the scripture he had just read, but twisted, distorted, mocking him with an echo that didn't belong to him. Elias stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him. He realized this was no simple haunting. Whatever he had unleashed was not retreating. It was fighting back, harder than before. His own words, turned against him, felt like chains binding him in place. And that's when he saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, gathering in the corner where the light couldn't reach. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was forming. At that same moment, Miriam felt her prayers deepen into something she could not explain. Her vision blurred, and she saw flashes as though she were standing inside Elias's home. She saw the broken mirror, the rising darkness, and Elias on his knees clutching the Bible as though it were his last breath. Her heart raced. This was no longer a quiet battle hidden behind closed doors. If Elias lost the struggle, it could spill far beyond him, dragging others into its grip. The town itself was beginning to stir. Lights flickered in neighbors' windows. Dogs barked without reason. Some residents, who had once whispered about Elias in fear, now reported strange disturbances in their own homes. Cold drafts, unexplained knocks, restless sleep. The darkness Elias wrestled with was no longer his alone. It was spreading like smoke across the community. Inside his house, Elias felt torn in two. The Bible in his hands radiated a strength he had never known. Yet the shadow loomed larger, its whisper growing louder until it drowned out his thoughts. It hissed his name, promising him safety, wealth, and even freedom, if only he would let go of the book. His knuckles turned white as he clutched the pages, sweat dripping down his face. The war between black magic and the Bible was no longer a question of power, it was now a question of survival. And just when Elias thought he could no longer hold on, the door to his house creaked open. Someone had entered,